Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining us today for today's webinar. Also, I want to thank Professor Khalid Husseini, the guest speaker for today's webinar. Professor Khalid Husseini is a research lead and a professor of accounting and financial management at University of Portsmouth in UK. He has published 135 referred papers in academic journal and international conference proceedings. He has rapidly growing research reputation around his principal's research area concerned with corporate narrative reporting. He has been awarded the prestigious 2007 Best Paper Award of the British Accounting Review and the prestigious 2012 Best Paper Award of the Journal of Risk Finance. He has a co-editor-in-chief of Jafra and associate editor of JAAR and AJAP as well. This is me, Dr. Ahmed Al-Kattan, the founder of ITAR Group. Our webinar today, Professor Khalid, he will take his role in the speech for 45 or 1 to 1 hour. Then after that, we'll open the floor for any question. Regularly, we'll have 45 minutes, but thank you, Dr. Khalid, for giving us from his time, and he opened the floor for any question until everyone finish all the questions that you want to ask him. So thank you so much, and again thank you, Professor Khalid, for accepting my invitation, and the floor is yours. Dr. Khalid, sorry, before you start, I actually ask all the audience regarding which they prefer, Arabic or English, and the percentage right now is 36% in Arabic and 62 in English. So most like 60% or more than 60% they prefer in English, so you can do whatever you want. The floor is yours, Professor. Thank you.
Okay, so Assalamu alaikum. First of all, thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for inviting me to share my experience about writing PhD. The talk will be in English, and for questions, I welcome any questions in Arabic or in English. So if the question in Arabic, I will answer in Arabic, and I will translate it to English. And of course, if it's English, just I will reply in English. So I will share my screen. I know that I have 45 minutes. So it's a short presentation, and at the same time, it is very important topic. So the topic today is about the structure of the thesis and the connection between chapter. And I chose this topic because we have received a number of requests by a number of PhD students who just need to know how can they structure their PhD and how can they be sure that there is a connection between chapters. And I think the students choose one of the most important topics for their PhD journey, because sometimes the students have done a good contribution, has used the right research methodology, have some interesting results, but in the Viva, they suffer a lot because the examiners can't understand his contribution because of the way the student he has written his PhD or her PhD. And here I'm sharing with you one of the major comments a student can receive from examiners at the end of her or his Viva. Sometimes the examiners believe that the thesis contains no coherent and or certainly no cohesion literature review, or the literature doesn't cover the main areas related to the thesis, or what has been done is not enough. So sometimes you heard about, or you can see this word in your first time in your life, coherent and cohesion, but you don't know what does it mean. How can I make my chapter coherent and cohesion? And if these comments for chapter 1 or chapter the literature review only, I think you have to do like at least 3 months to work on the chapter to make the chapter is coherent and cohesion. Sometimes the comment is related to the whole thesis. So from the chapter 1 until the end of the thesis, the comment is we can't see any coherent and any cohesion material in the thesis provided, and this be considered as one of the major concerns examiners might raise on your PhD. So first of all, before start talking about the structure of the thesis and the connection between chapters, let's firstly try to understand what the meaning of coherent and what the meaning of cohesion. So if you search any dictionary, you will find these words are quite similar. They contain the same meaning, but cohesion is related to the macro level of the text. It's related to the words you have used in the sentence and the sentence itself and how the words and sentence are joined together. But for coherent is related to the overall structure of the chapter, the link between different sections in the chapters, and the link between different chapters in your PhD thesis. So if your work, if your PhD or if your master degree is not cohesion and not coherent, it is more likely that you will get like a major revision. So you need at least 12 months to make your PhD thesis a cohesion and coherent. To do that, it's very simple. Just you need to be sure that you use the right language in each sentence in your PhD, and this time you achieve the cohesion level. And also you need to make the order of the chapters and the orders of the sections in each chapters make sense. So you need a logic order for the organization of each chapter as well as the organization for the whole thesis. If you have done so, in this case, you have a good thesis which contains a cohesion and coherent arguments. And in this case, the examiners will not raise any concern. So the point here is not about the language. If you have grammar mistake, these all minor issues. But here we are looking at the sentence itself, the word used in the sentence, if the sentence makes sense or not. And for the coherent, the link between chapters as well as the link between the sections in each chapter and the link between the arguments in these sections. So coherent is achieved when sentence and ideas are connected and flow smoothly together. So we need to be sure that all ideas are connected together. So all chapters are connected together. So there is link between the chapters. So the reader will read your work as a story. In this case, you have coherent. Cohesion, for each sentence, you need to be sure that the word is used in the right place. The sentence itself makes sense. The sentence itself is linked with the previous sentence and the following sentence. So the most benefit for having a coherent and cohesion chapter or work, this makes the life easy for the reader of your work. So in this case, supervisor, external examiners will be able to understand the story or the ideas in your PhD thesis. So to make your PhD coherent and cohesion, you need firstly to understand the structure of your PhD. How could you structure the PhD? Also, you need to understand how many chapters you need to produce. You need also to understand what sections should be included in each of these chapters. And the most important things to assure that you have the coherent material, you need to be sure that these chapters are linked together, and also the sections in each chapter are linked together. In this way, your thesis will be easy to read, and if it is easy to read, it will be easy to understand, and this might increase your chance to give a good impression about your work. And if you have contribution in your thesis, I think in this case, you have a great chance to get this work acceptable by the examiner, and hence you will not have any major correction or any major problem. Generally speaking, we have two different types of PhD thesis. The first type is the one which is very well known in the Arab world, which is the monograph PhD or the conventional PhD thesis. It's a monograph or a conventional or considered as a textbook-based PhD thesis because it has the traditional way of presenting your research. So it starts by introduction, then a chapter on the literature review. After that, a chapter about the development of the research hypothesis based on some theories or some concepts. After that, chapter 4, the methodology. And then you have the chapter about the findings and the discussion. Finally, you will find the conclusion chapter. For the traditional PhD thesis, in terms of the number of chapters, there is no fixed number. So you might find a traditional PhD thesis for 5 chapters only. Sometimes you can find a PhD thesis for 6 chapters only. Yesterday, I examined a PhD student, and she has 10 chapters in her PhD. So again, the structure of the conventional PhD thesis is very subjective and based on the agreement between the student and the supervisor. So before you start making link between chapters or thinking about a link between chapters, you need firstly to identify the contents of each chapter. Once you identify the content of each chapter, then you need to think about the link between chapters. And also, when you discuss the content of each chapter, you need to think about the link between different sections in this chapter. So you need to be sure that there is a link between the chapters, as well as link between separate sections in the chapter itself. So let's look at this type of the monograph PhD thesis. I assume this thesis is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 chapters. I'm sorry for the mistake. So we have 7 chapters. Chapter 1 is the introduction. Chapter 2 is the literature review. Chapter 3 discusses the theories and the development of the research hypothesis. Chapter 4 is the research methodology. Chapter 5 is the empirical analysis. Chapter 6 is a discussion. Chapter 7 is the conclusion. So these now 7 chapters, and this is the 7th chapter style. Someone might say, no, I don't need 7 chapters. I think 5 chapters is enough. So they can start by chapter 1, introduction. Chapter 2 and 3 can be merged together to discuss the literature and theories and the research hypothesis. In this case, chapter 3 will be the research method. Chapter 4, we can merge the empirical analysis with the discussion together in one chapter, and then the conclusion. So first of all, you need to think about the structure of your thesis. After that, you need to think about the content of each chapter. What should I include in each of these chapters? For example, if we talk about the introduction, of course, you need to give a brief overview or background about the topic to the reader. So normally the introduction starts by an overview or background. In this background, this followed by the research problem you try to solve and the importance of your research. Then you need to clearly mention to the research objectives, your research questions, your research motivations, the potential contributions, the key findings, and then you end this chapter by discussing the structure of the thesis. So this chapter 1, before moving to the second chapter or the following chapter, you need to keep in mind that you should have a link between chapters. And in chapter 1, you have a chance here in the last section, the last section, the structure of the thesis. In this structure, you are linking this chapter with the whole thesis. So don't worry. So for this chapter, in the structure of the thesis, you will say what chapter 2 is about, what chapter 3 is about, what chapter 4 is about until the end of the thesis. So now you can link chapter 1 with the rest of the thesis by mentioning to the content of each of these chapters. When we move to chapter 2, it is better to start chapter 2 by linking the chapter to chapter 1. So you can say, for example, in chapter 1, section 1.3, we have 3 objectives. So we review the literature related to these 3 objectives. So section 2.1 is related to objective 1. Section 2.2 is related to the second objective. And section 2.3 is related to the third objective. So this is the link. So at the start of the chapter 2, you refer to the objectives mentioned in chapter 1 or the research question in chapter 1. So in this case, you try to connect chapter 1 with chapter 2. What is the main content of chapter 2? It's a literature review, so you need to identify what has been done in the literature. So the chapter should be structured in a logical manner. So you start by surveying the literature, explaining what has been done in the literature. Then you need to move to the second section about the research gap. What are the research gap in this area? And after that, you can add another section to explain which of these gaps will be considered in your research. So I repeat again, in chapter 2, I start the chapter by linking the chapter with chapter 1. So to achieve the objectives, I review the literature related to these 3 objectives. And you end the chapter 2 by identifying the research gap. Before leaving chapter 2 and moving to chapter 3, you need to make a link between chapter 2 and 3. So in chapter 2, you identify the research gaps. So you need to explain how you will fill these gaps. And you can say that I will fill 2 or 3 of these gaps. And to fill these gaps, I will use, let's say, agency theory to develop the research hypothesis. So we need to mention to the following chapter, we'll discuss in details the agency theory as well as the research hypothesis. So in chapter 3, you can start chapter 3 by linking the chapter to chapter 1 to explain that you try to answer the research questions in chapter 1. Also, you can start mentioning to chapter 2 in chapter 3 by explaining that you try to fill the gaps identified in chapter 2. And then in chapter 3 itself, you start discussing the different theories and you start developing the research hypothesis. Before ending chapter 4, you need to introduce, before ending chapter 3, you need to introduce chapter 4. So at the end of chapter 3, you need to mention that to test this research hypothesis, you will use, let's say, qualitative research or quantitative research. And the research method will explain in details the rationale for choosing qualitative or quantitative research. So by this way, you will introduce chapter 4. Then when you start chapter 4, the research method, you can refer to chapter 3 to test the research hypothesis. As mentioned in chapter 3, I use this method. Also, you can refer to chapter 2 by saying that to fill the gap in the literature, as mentioned in chapter 2, I try to fill this point. You can also mention chapter 1 by saying that to answer the research question, number 1, I will use this particular method. Also in chapter 4, for the research methodology, you need to explain clearly the context. So if you focus, let's say, on Saudi Arabia, you need to explain why you choose one single country. If you have a cross-country study, you need to explain why you choose more than one country and on what basis you choose these companies in your analysis. You need to explain the sample selection criteria. How did you choose your sample period, justification of the research method, why you choose specific research method, how did you collect the data, the variables used in the analysis, what's the definition of these variables, how did you measure these variables, and what is the source of data. So by the end of chapter 4, you need to introduce chapter 5 to say that the following chapter will provide the analysis in order to accept or reject the research hypothesis or in order to answer the research questions. Then the empirical analysis starts here by discussing the descriptive analysis, main findings, correlation analysis. So in this chapter, you will try to accept or reject the research hypothesis and answer the research questions. The research questions raised in chapter 1. So here you can mention to the research questions what's the brief answer for this research question. Also, the research hypothesis has been mentioned in chapter 3. So in chapter 5 here, you will find yourself make links with chapter 1 and chapter 3. Chapter number 6, the discussion. Here in the discussion, you link chapter 6 with chapter 5. Based on the result you have achieved in chapter 5, you need to discuss this result. And the word discussing here means that you are linking the result with the theory and the literature. To what extent your results are in line with the theory and the literature. Finally, the conclusion. In the conclusion, you need to show the reader that you have met the research objective. So in the introduction, you have a group of research objectives. In the conclusion, you need to show evidence that you have achieved these objectives. Also, you need to discuss the impact of your research on practice. You need to discuss the research limitations, and you need to end your chapter by discussing any ideas for future research. My advice here, when you write any of these chapters, you need to keep an eye on your main objective. So what is your main objective? So whatever the chapter you are writing now, you need to think about, does it link with the research objective or not? So for the traditional PhD thesis, the maximum number of words, especially in most of the UK universities, is 80,000 words. This is the maximum. And it's about 300 pages. And this total doesn't include appendices at all. So to summarize, in order to make links between chapters in the traditional PhD thesis, you need to be sure that in chapter 1, you have the ending paragraph about the structure of the thesis. So this sample of the paragraph, the thesis is structured as follows. Chapter 2 reviews the academic literature concerning the area I'm interested in. Chapter 3 describes the methodology. Chapter 4 analyzes the impact on this variable Chapter 5 examines the association between these variables. Chapter 6 summarizes the main findings. And if we have chapter 7 for the conclusion. So this is one of the most important way to connect chapter 1 with the rest of the thesis by introducing a paragraph about the structure of the thesis. Also, you need to make sure that you have a connection between what has been done in the previous chapters. So always try to refer to the previous chapter. So here are some examples which explain how to refer to the previous chapter. The first step in answering my research questions, see section 1.3 in chapter 1, is to review prior research to understand what has been done in the area of research on accounting. And here is another way. In the last chapter, I showed a significant research gap in this area of research. I show that you can explain what did you find as a research gap. In this chapter, so I review different theories to develop a set of research hypotheses. So as you can see in this sentence, we refer to the previous or last chapter, and then we introduce the current chapter. The following sentence, having argued in the previous chapter that the impact of this variable on this variable could be positive or negative, in this chapter, I discuss the quantitative methods used to test the research hypothesis. So here, this chapter or this sentence refers to the development of the research hypothesis in the previous chapter with the research methodology in the current chapter. Here's this sentence, to test the research hypothesis discussed in chapter 3, for example, I use regression analysis, and the analysis show that you can write your analysis. Then, as a result of X, which I established in the last chapter, although the findings are consistent with this theory, the literature, the findings suggest that managers and the policymakers should consider. So again, I'm discussing the result here, and at the same time, I'm referring to the previous chapter. The aim of the chapter was, so here when I write the conclusion, the aim of the chapter was, we found that the research has the following implications, and the limitation of this research are, and future research could consider this point. So this like sentence which help us to make the connections between chapters. So the connection between chapters is done by simply referring to the last chapter at the start of the new chapter. Also, another way for making this connection, you need to also focus the attention of the reader on what is the important of the current chapter. So you can say in this chapter, I examine this phenomena to answer the first research question. I will test to see if X variable affect Y variable and hence accept or reject the research hypothesis. As explained in the introduction, so I'm referring to the introduction here, I am to examine the relationship between these variables in this country. In this chapter, I will discuss why this country is unique. So I will discuss the uniqueness of the country and how this country differs from other countries or other contexts. So the idea here to help the reader to understand the connection and also to make the connections clear, you need to be sure that you clearly identify the content of the chapter and also why it is important. And of course, in each chapter, we should have an introduction or a background to introduce the chapter, to tell the reader what this chapter is about. So that's why we believe that at the start of each chapter, the researcher or the researchers should provide a detailed structure of the chapter. So you can say, I will begin my analysis. I will begin by examining the definition of the concept I'm interested in, and then move to seeing how these were applied in my country, for example. Or I will first explain my orientation to the research process, and so on. So here's the idea, plus connecting chapters by using a sentence referring to the previous chapter. You need to be sure that each chapter has a clear introduction which show the aim of the chapter. Also remember that each chapter should end it by a conclusion or a summary, and in this conclusion or the summary, you need to highlight to the reader that what are the main message you try to tell the reader from this chapter, what the main conclusion the reader could learn from this chapter without reading the chapter again. Plus, in the conclusion of the chapter or in the summary of the chapter, it will be a great opportunity to link the chapter with the following chapter. So if we look again to the structure of the thesis, I just presented this slide a few minutes ago. Okay, so this is structure. So the best way to structure your thesis and to make it coherent and cohesion, you need to start thinking about the structure from day one in your PhD journey. So in the day one in your PhD, when you start your research degree study, you need to talk with your supervisor about the structure of your work. So you need to have a plan to make this structure clear so you can follow the structure. And when you read some articles, you can link what you are reading with the structure. So you can say, this part in this article can help me in writing a good research method. And this part can help me in reviewing the literature. So you can link the content of each article to each of these chapters. And at the same time, you can find out how these sections have been linked together in the article you are reading, which is related to your topic. So let's see examples of the traditional PhD thesis. So here in this PhD, I assume that the student is doing the traditional or monograph PhD, and the student examine the impact of board diversity on performance. So if the student is doing or is making the traditional PhD, he need to discuss or she need to discuss with the supervisor how many chapters he or she should produce. So the minimum chapters for the monograph is 5. So you will not find less than 5 chapters in a PhD. If there is any PhD with less than 5 chapters, it might indicate that there is a problem or problematic. Okay, so if I need to discuss the impact of board diversity on performance, how can I structure my thesis if I'm using the traditional based thesis? First of all, you should have an introduction. So chapter 1 is the introduction, which gave like some idea about the research aim or objective, the research questions, the motivations, the contributions, the main findings, and remember the structure of the thesis. Because this structure of the thesis links to chapter 2, 3, 4, and 5. After that, you need a huge chapter which discuss the literature related to the area. If we are talking about board of directors, we are talking about one of the main governance mechanisms. So we expect the student will discuss the relationship between governance and performance in general. Then the student will discuss the relationship between diversity and performance. From discussing this literature, they will criticize the literature, and then they will identify the research gaps. I'm sorry for the typo here or the mistake. So the student will identify the research gaps. After that, they will explain which of these gaps will be considered. After that, they will start thinking about developing the research hypothesis. So they will use some theories to develop these hypotheses. So you will find very comprehensive chapter in the traditional based thesis. So you might find some definitions like what we mean by governance, what do we mean by diversity, some explanation about the regulations related to governance and the corporate governance code in the country. So you might find a huge amount of information in chapter 2. Once chapter 2 is completed, the student should end the chapter by mentioning to chapter 3. So to say that to test this research hypothesis, I will use a qualitative research method or quantitative research method. Chapter 3 will discuss these methods. In chapter 3, you will find a huge discussion about the difference between research method and research methodology, and the rationale for using each of these research methods, when we can use qualitative, when we can use quantitative, and then the student might move to the research models, discuss the research models in details, discuss the variable definitions, sample selection criteria, sample period, source of data, a lot of discussion about the research methodology. So in the monograph, you will find some general discussion in the research methodology, as well as more specific discussion about the method the student will use in order to test the research hypothesis. In chapter 4, the student will start the analysis, doing some analysis, getting some results, and at the end of the chapter, he will discuss this result to explain the meaning of the finding and if the findings are in line with the literature or not. The thesis will end it in chapter 5, which show us the conclusion. So this is the style of the 5 chapters monograph PhD thesis. Sometimes the supervisor have a comment saying that I can see chapter 2 is very huge and chapter 4 also is very huge. Some supervisor advise student to make a good balance between chapters. So you can't have one chapter for 150 pages and another chapter just for 10 or 15 pages. Some supervisor advise students to make this balance between chapters. So if they found chapter 2 is very huge, they might ask you to divide this chapter into 2 chapters. So in chapter 2, in our case here, we have literature and the hypothesis development. So they can ask you to divide this chapter to 2 chapters. Also in chapter 4, we have the analysis as well as the discussion for the analysis. So if this chapter is very huge, the supervisor can advise the student to divide this chapter into 2 chapters. So if so, how the PhD thesis will look like? Here we have the same title, same content. Chapter 1, introduction. Chapter 2, the literature. But here in chapter 3, we discuss the development of the research hypothesis using the relevant theories. Chapter 4, methodology. Chapter 5 is the analysis. And we ended chapter 6 with the discussion and the conclusion in chapter 7. So this is the 7 chapters style. Some supervisors also might ask about adding a chapter discussing the context of the study. So you are studying the impact of board diversity on performance for the Egyptian context. The supervisor might ask you to have a complete chapter about Egypt to explain why Egypt, why you choose Egypt, why corporate governance in Egypt matter, what is the uniqueness of corporate governance in Egypt. So in this case, rather than having 7 chapters, you need to add another chapter for the Egyptian context. So if you can see here, we have exactly the same structure, same title. And if you look at chapter 3, you'll find a new chapter called chapter 3, the context of the study. In this context, we can discuss governance code in Egypt, stock market in Egypt, the accounting standard or accounting system in Egypt. In this case, we will have 8 chapters. But if we look at chapter 6, you will find that we have one chapter for the analysis. In some fields, like in business field, in accounting field, we expect that the student will have more than one contribution. Chapter 6 here indicates that this student might have just one chapter, one objective, and in the business field, we always feel that one objective might not be enough. So we say that at least you should have 2 chapters for the analysis, 3 is better. So in this case, suppose that the student will follow this advice, and rather than having 1 chapter, he will have 2 or 3 empirical chapters. So in this case, you will find that the PhD thesis is 10 chapters rather than 5 as I started with. For the 10 chapters, chapter 1, introduction, chapter 2, literature, chapter 3, the context with the country you are focused on, chapter 4, the development of the research hypothesis, chapter 5, the methodology, then chapter 6, 7, 8, 7, 6 is the analysis. Here, I'm looking at gender diversity in 6. Chapter 7, I will look at different type of diversity. So I will look at age diversity. Chapter 8, I will look at nationality diversity. So each empirical analysis is explained in a separate chapter. So in this case, you show that you have 3 major contributions by considering different types of board diversity. Then chapter 9 can conclude the whole result in chapter 6, 7, and 8, and chapter 10 is the conclusion. So this is the first type of the PhD thesis. The second type, we called it as paper-based. Paper-based means that the thesis will have a freestanding paper or papers, and these freestanding papers should be related to each other. So in most of the universities, they ask for 3 separate papers, and in Portsmouth, we have 4 paper style. So how does this look like? It looks like as introduction, then paper 1, paper 2, paper 3, paper 4, and then the conclusion. And in each of these papers, you will find all the information we have mentioned here. So you'll find for each paper, you will find the paper have different sections rather than chapters. So section 1, the introduction, section 2, the literature review, section 3 will be theories, section 4, the research method, section 5, the empirical analysis, section 6, the discussion, and section 7, the conclusion. So these will be for each paper. So for each paper, you will find the title for the paper, you will find an abstract for the paper, you will find the keywords for the paper, you will find the same structure as I mentioned, and each paper ended by a list of references. And for the PhD by publication, again, the maximum number of words is still 80,000 words. And in some universities, they have a minimum word limit. In Portsmouth, for example, the minimum word limit is 40,000 words. So again, when you do this paper-based thesis, you need to be sure that in the introduction, you link the 4 papers together, you explain the aim and objectives you try to achieve, and reflect this objective on the 4 papers you are proposing to do. You also need to explain the link between these papers. So these papers should be linked together. Otherwise, it will not make sense to have compilation PhD thesis. In the conclusion, also, you need to discuss the main findings of the 4 papers and the interrelationship between the findings of these 4 papers. So let's look at the example we have about the impact of board diversity on performance. So if I need to make a PhD completion or the paper-based PhD using board diversity and its impact on performance, what can I do? First of all, you need chapter 1, introduction to the topic, and to link the 4 papers together. If you look at paper 1, you can talk about gender diversity and performance. Paper 2 discuss different type of diversity, which is age diversity and its relation with performance. Paper 3, it talk about nationality and performance. Paper 4, education and performance. And chapter 6 gives the conclusion about the link of this paper. So if you read this, for the title of these papers, you will find that these papers are linked together because they are talking about diversity in general and the impact of diversity on performance. But each paper looks at different types of diversity. So this is what I mean here by the link between the paper. Paper say gender, female or male. The second paper talk about age. The third one is nationality, and the fourth one is education. Some students start the PhD journey by doing a literature review. For the literature review, they can do systematic literature review, or they can do narrative literature review. They can do meta-analysis. So again, chapter 1, the overall introduction to the 4 papers. Sorry for the mistake again here. Paper 1 here could be the systematic literature review on the relationship between diversity and performance. Paper 2, diversity and accounting performance. Paper 3, diversity and stock market performance. Paper 4, diversity and non-financial performance. So what you can see here, in these 4 papers, all the papers discuss the relationship between diversity and performance. The first one is systematic literature review. The second one discusses the impact of diversity on accounting performance. In the third one, we look at different types of performance, which is market for the stock market performance. And paper 4 discuss the impact of diversity on non-financial performance. So again, you can easily interrelate the papers together or discuss these papers together because they are talking about 2 main concepts, diversity and performance. So in order to be sure that your structure is coherent and logical, you need to check each section of your thesis, and you need to remind yourself with the main objective or the main aim of this section, and ask yourself a simple question: does this section or including this section in your chapter make sense? Does this section achieved its aim or objective or not? If not, you need to reconsider the existence of this section. Secondly, does each section logically and coherently develop your arguments? So you need here to look at the argument itself. So if the title is about, let's say, if the title is about the measurement of governance, so try to be sure that all the arguments under this section is related to the measurement of corporate governance. So don't talk about the measurement of performance, because performance will not be related in this section. Don't talk about disclosure, because disclosure might not be related in this section as well. Also, it is better to use subheadings in each section to make the structure logic for the reader. Also, you need to look at your table of contents and try to link the table of contents with the major sections or subsections in the chapter to be sure that these sections and subsections make a logic structure. Also, coherent across chapters, you need to read the introduction of each chapter in order. So start by chapter 1, it will be background, the chapter 2, chapter 3. From the introduction, you are introducing the chapter itself. So try to find out if you are following the same style in each chapter. Does what you write in this introduction make sense? Did you really covered all the point raised in the introduction of the chapter, or you need to revise this introduction again? Also, you need to be sure that there is a link between the main idea of the previous chapter. So always when you write the introduction of any chapter, try to start by linking what has been done in the previous chapter, then introduce the current chapter. Also, try to be sure that the introduction itself covers the main subsections or sections in the chapter itself. So in one paragraph, try to mention to the main purpose of the chapter, and then if the chapter contains number of sections or subsections, it will be better to explain these subsections in details. So in the introduction, as I mentioned, you need to link back to the previous chapter and earlier parts of the thesis. So if we are now in the methodology chapter, you can start the methodology chapter by saying that to achieve the research aim in chapter 1, you can refer to chapter 1, and to test the research hypothesis in chapter 3, this chapter will use qualitative research to do that. So you can explain in this way. And also be sure that each chapter have a clear aim, because this aim will help the reader to evaluate the chapter, to see at the end of reading the chapter the extent to which the author achieved the aim stated. Coherent between paragraphs. This is very, very important here, because you need to be sure that there is a logic of the flow of the ideas or of paragraphs or sentence in your chapter. So don't jump between ideas. Be sure that you covered the idea fully, and then you have a link sentence to link the following ideas. Don't jump between ideas without having this clear link. Also, you need to use at the beginning, at the end of the paragraphs, some linkage statements. So you can say, as mentioned above, so you can continue. And at the end of paragraph, you can say, the following sections will discuss this and this and this. Also, when you read your work, before you submit your work to your supervisor for evaluation, try to highlight the main keywords you try to emphasize, the key ideas, and check if these keywords and idea match the main aim and objective of the chapter or not. Finally, in the conclusion, you need to be sure that, first of all, each chapter should end it by a summary or a conclusion, except the introduction and the conclusion. So from chapter 2 until the chapter of the discussion, the chapter before the conclusion, you should be sure that you have a summary at the end of the chapter. Secondly, you need to be sure that in each conclusion, you have achieved the aim and objectives mentioned in the introduction of the chapter. Because when we examine a student, we have different questions. One of these questions, to what extent the student achieve his aim. So we see if the student achieves the aims of the PhD in total, and also if the student achieve the aim of the chapter or each chapter as well. Also remember, in the conclusion of each chapter, except the introduction and the conclusion, each chapter have a link to the following chapter. I think in this way you will have a clear, coherent and cohesion PhD thesis, and this will increase your chance to get your award of the PhD. But I hope that this kind of brief introduction about the linkage between the chapters makes sense to you, and I hope this will be helpful. And I'm happy to listen to you and to get your questions in Arabic or in English, and I'm happy to answer all your questions. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Professor Khalid Husseini, for informative and useful information, which will be so useful for all master and PhD students. And I think the same criteria or the same scenario will go with the paper as well. How to link all, the chapters or not the parts in, let's say, in the papers from introduction to literature and so on. So thank you so much, and we'll open the floor for any question, please. And also I forget to say this webinar will take the question as well from YouTube in the end. So anyone have any question, just raise hand and we'll go one by one to ask Dr. Khalid the questions. Ali العجمي.
السلام عليكم. في البداية ودي أشكر الدكتور أحمد صراحة على المجهود اللي قائم فيه على هذه القناة وعلى هذا النشر العلمي، وعلى أيضا الشكر موصول للبروف خالد، يعني بصراحة يعني على ما تقدمه، الله يجعل إن شاء الله في موازين أعمال حسناتك إن شاء الله. بروف خالد، عندي سؤال بالنسبة خصوص الديسكريبتيف أناليسيس، في أي شابتر راح يكون؟ وأيضا بالنسبة للكونتريبيوشن، هل أتكلم عن الكونتريبيوشن يعني وأذكره أسوي له سب هيدنج، ولا يعني يكتفى أنه فقط أنه يذكر؟
طيب شكرا جزيلا دكتور علي على سؤالك. بالنسبة أتكلم بالعربي ولا بالإنجليزي الأول؟
بالعربي يا دكتور، دام السؤال بالعربي.
I will answer in Arabic and then I will translate. بالنسبة للديسكريبتيف أناليسيس، معظم الدراسات بتضع الديسكريبتيف أناليسيس في الشابتر الخاص بالأناليسيس، ولكن في بعض الدراسات القليلة جدا بتضع الديسكريبتيف أناليسيس في الشابتر الخاص بالميثودولوجي، لأنك أنت بتحكي عن السامبل بتاعتك، فالبعض بيفضل إن يكون الديسكريبتيف مع الميثودولوجي وليس مع الفصل النهائي اللي هو الخاص بالأناليسيس. الجزئية الثانية بالنسبة للكونتريبيوشن، الافضل طبعا يكون في سيكشن خاص بالكونتريبيوشن، وايضا الافضل تكون الكونتريبيوشن واضحه في الفصل الاول من الرساله، حتى يعني تقنع القارئ ان في كونتريبيوشن وتمهده نفسيا ان في بعض المساهمات العلميه المقدمه في البحث.
ممتاز، الله يجزاك خير دكتور. معلش في سؤال اخر بالنسبه للسيستماتيك ليترشر ريفيو، اذا استخدمته فهل في الكونكلوجن برضو اعيد الفيوتشر ريسيرش، ولا خلاص يكتفى فيه انه ذكرته في الليترشر ريفيو؟
معلش ممكن تعيد السؤال ثاني؟
بالنسبه اذا انا استخدمت في الليترشر ريفيو، استخدمت سيستماتيكال ليترشر ريفيو،
نعم،
راح اذكر فيه الفيوتشر ريسيرش.
نعم.
هل ايضا في الكونكلوجن ارجع اعيد اذكر الفيوتشر ريسيرش؟
نعم. في الكونكلوجن ممكن تشير الى بعض الفيوتشر ريسيرش اللي انت ذكرتها في السيستماتيك ليترشر ريفيو، او لو تقدر تقدم افكار جديده قد يكون افضل يعني.
بارك الله فيك دكتور، شكرا لك.
بارك الله فيك. طيب Ali asked about descriptive analysis. Where should we put the descriptive analysis? I said that we have two schools here. Descriptive analysis could be in the methodology section after describing the data and after discussing the sample selection criteria, but majority of the PhD thesis and the master thesis puts the descriptive analysis in the empirical chapter. The second question was about contribution. Should we have a section about contribution? I said yes, we should have, and the contribution should be in the introductory chapter or in the introduction chapter. The last question was about systematic literature review. If he has a systematic literature review chapter, should he discuss the future research again in the conclusion chapter? My answer is yes, but don't repeat the same information in the systematic literature review. You can suggest new ideas rather than those reported in the systematic literature review, or you can summarize the main ideas you suggest from the literature review chapter. Any other questions?
Yes, Sumaya.
Assalamu alaikum.
السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Thank you for this opportunity for ITAR Group, and thank you, Doctor, for this valuable and knowledgeable lecture. It was very knowledgeable. My question is about the papers to be published in the framework of the thesis. You have mentioned that we can in your university there are the PhD students must publish at least 4 papers. So I'm asking about the relation and the thematic of those 4 papers. There must be we should have the results of the whole work of the thesis, then we separate them into papers, or we work on each paper on its own and then we gather them to make the full thesis.
Okay.
This is my question.
What we do in our university here, it's up to the student. Some student try to work on each paper. So once he finished the paper 1, he moved to paper 2, then paper 3 and 4, and then put all these papers together and write the introduction and the conclusion and submit to the for examination.
Thank you very much. So the result mustn't be done at the first place. Yes.
As you like. Some students prefer to collect data for the 4 chapters, run the analysis for the 4 chapters, and once they get the result for everything, they start writing paper one by one.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate your answer. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Iman.
Hello.
Hello, Iman.
Hello.
Hello.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Yeah, I have some questions related to the introduction. So in our university, the style of the thesis is introduction, then method, then result 1, result 2, result 3, and then discussion. So I'm asking, can we like add some literature review in a part of method chapter when we use some quantitative analysis method? Then can we add some literature review in the method chapter? Is it possible to do that?
What you said now, you said introduction, method 1, result 2, discussion. So there is no literature chapter, yes?
Yes, there is no literature chapter.
Yes, I think in this case, you need to write the literature either in the introduction or the method chapter. So I think in this case, any literature related to the methodology should be in the method chapter.
Okay, and in the introduction, so in this case, the introduction gonna be a long chapter, right? Because we have to write the literature on it.
Yes, but I think in this case, you need just to focus on the key articles, which is directly related to your research aim and objective. So you will not review 100 articles, for example. So try to find out the articles which is directly related to yours and review the article, criticize them, and identify the gaps in order to highlight the contribution.
Okay. In this case, can we like, for example, if there is a lot of studies use the same kind of aim, but with different results, can we write all of them together. Like, for example, saying that a lot of papers done the same kind of work, and the average result was between this number to this number, or we have to write each paper writing.
No, not each paper. You need to group these papers based on their result or based on their objective, or so you should have grouping them, all of them. So it might be better to have all the studies summarized in a table, and then you can to the table. Based on this table, majority of this study have this objective, so you can refer to some of them as an example. These studies group find this relationship, the other study found different relationship. So you can discussing the literature in grouping rather than one by one.
Okay, and after that we have to write the contribution.
No, after that you have to write the research gaps, what has not been done.
Okay.
Then the contribution.
Then the contribution. Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And for the discussion, the final discussion, we have to relate to the literature in the introduction chapter, right?
Yes, please.
Or
yes.
Yeah. Okay.
To the introduction, or if your discussion or your finding related to the methodology and you have some literature in the methodology, you can also link to the methodology chapter.
Okay. Okay. Good. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. قصي.
السلام عليكم.
عليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
سؤالي دكتور باختصار بالنسبة للcontribution، هل ممكن أن نكتب main contribution and second contribution inside the thesis, or just we can say the main contribution and link it with the objective? And thank you.
So can you repeat again, main contribution and second?
يعني بالنسبة إلى الcontribution للthesis، هل ممكن نكتب main contribution وممكن أن نكتب بعد main contribution secondary contribution؟ يعني هناك يوجد نعم تحسين أساسي أو أساسي في الدراسة والتحسين الثانوي، يعني main contribution or just we can the main contribution 4 نقاط 5، يعني المفروض يكون main contribution for every objective, correct?
Yes, I think you need to look at your objectives and you need to show that you have achieved your objectives, and then in terms of the contribution, you might have a major contribution, this is the main contribution, this should be written. And if you have any minor contribution or some incremental contribution which is not major, I think also you need to mention to that. So mention to all the contributions you have offered to the literature.
Okay, thanks, Doctor.
You are welcome.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaykum salam.
Thank you, قصي. لبنى.
Hello, Doctor. First of all, I want to thank you for your very beneficial question. I'm a bit confused regarding something, however. Regarding my literature, which is where I'm going to include my theory and the variables that I'm going to talk about. And my contribution is going to actually be in the context of the study, not just the literature, it's not just the variable. So where do I write the context? Because I have an industry that I'm going to talk about, and I have a country to talk about. I read before that my country, or the country that I'm going to talk about, should be in the methodology chapter. Yes, I have so much to say about the country and how beneficial it is if we actually studied this variable in this country, as well as how beneficial it is to study this variable in this industry. So I'm confused where to write them. Should I make 2 literature chapters, or should I write them in the literature chapter alone, or part of it in the methodology? I'm not sure.
So your question is about the context, the country. Where should we write the country, information about the country?
The country as well as the industry, which I'm going to apply my theory on.
Industry and the country, yes?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think in your methodology, you need to explain in general terms the sample selection criteria. So one of these criteria is that you look at a sample of companies in one specific country. So I think in this case, you need to justify why you choose this country. So you can mention to the context of your study in the methodology section because it's related to data collection and sample selection criteria. Also, if you focus on a specific industry, I think you need to mention to this industry in the research methodology chapter as well. Sometimes, and this also might be a good idea, in the introduction, when you write the research motivations, you need to explain why you choose a specific country and why you focus on a specific industry. So in the introduction, in the section related to the research motivation, you can explain why this country and why this industry. And I think this will make the link between the introduction and the methodology chapter. Also, in the literature review, you can mention that there is a research gap, there is limited research in this country, and there is limited research in this specific industry. And in this case, you will have a link between introduction, literature review, and the methodology chapter. Some supervisors prefer to have a separate chapter on the country, on the context. I think in this case, this chapter could be placed before the methodology chapter.
Okay, great. Thank you, Doctor.
شكرا.
Thank you, Lubna. Ibrahim Bayoumi.
Assalamu alaikum.
عليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Ibrahim Bayoumi, researcher in Egypt. I'm a researcher in accounting in Sadat Academy. Please, doctor, I want to suggest me a topic for my master degree in accounting. If you please tell me a new topic, I can make it a research of my master's degree. Please, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ibrahim. Just I prefer to give general advice. It's difficult because there is a lot of topics. Today, for example, when I present one of the most interesting topics in governance, which is about diversity and performance. But I can't force any researcher to work on this topic. I think, first of all, you need to identify your research interest. What you are interested in. You might be interested in management accounting, or taxation, or auditing, or financial accounting. So
accounting,
yes.
Cost accounting. I prefer cost accounting.
Okay, so if you prefer cost accounting, I strongly suggest that you need to look at Management Accounting Research Journal. Look at the most recent articles published in this journal. You will find a lot of new brand new ideas. Look at these ideas and just choose one of them. I think this is the best way to find a topic. So read recent articles. I'm sure that you will find many ideas. So from these ideas, you will find yourself are interested in one of these. Take the idea, discuss with your supervisor. If he's happy, you can move forward. Because I can say to you now, for example, look at the activity-based costing or balanced scorecard, and just you read and write something about it. Discuss with your supervisor. He might say it is a very old idea, so you need something new. To get the new ideas on cost accounting, I strongly advise you to look at top-ranked journals in cost accounting or management accounting.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. Lamia.
السلام عليكم.
عليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
شكرا يا دكتور على السيشن، بجد كانت مفيدة جدا.
الحمد لله.
وكنت عايزة استأذن حضرتك أسأل على حاجة related للiterature review.
اتفضل.
In my case أنا في literature review كنت كاتبة كل variable literature اللي covered في البارت ده من يعني على الفاريبل ده. and when I submitted للسوبرفايزر كان بيقول لي ان انا لو عملت الفايفا كده هيبقى عندي major correction ان انا مش عامله الليترشر بتاعي theory based. واكشلي whoever I know submitted his thesis فعلا بالمنظر ده كان عنده مشكله في الليترشر ان هو it's not theory based. I want you to tell us the structure of the literature review. ازاي how can we link الكتابه في الليترشر ريفيو بحيث انها مش هو variable واكتب كل الحاجه اللي عليه وبعد كده ادخل على الفاريبل اللي بعده واكتب كل الحاجه اللي عليه. بس فهي دي مشكله. I need to know more about the structure of the literature review نفسه.
Okay, so for the تحبي بالعربي ولا بالانجليزي؟
whatever يعني مش فارق.
بالنسبة for the literature, if you have different variables and if you cover different variables, it might be better to explain how these variables affect your dependent variable. And to explain how these variables affect dependent variables, don't use literature only. You can use theories. So which field are you in? Which
finance.
Finance. What's the topic is?
Microfinance.
Microfinance. So if you have different theories, explain the market microfinance or explain the finance behavior or behavioral finance, I think in your discussing the variable itself, you can start basing your discussion about the theories, which for each study you reviewed, you look at the empirical side of the article, you can look at the theoretical part of the article as well, explain what the authors expect and then what they found when they have done their empirical analysis. So this one way. The other way, you can keep the literature as it is, but add a section explaining the research gaps in this empirical literature. And after that, you can explain what the theories tell us about these topics and how the theories suggest an answer or like to fill this research gap.
So you suggest that I can leave it as it is, but to add other two sections in the literature, first one, the literature gap, and the other, what are the output of the theories I have been talking about?
No, I'm suggesting two scenarios. Scenario number one, keep them as they are and try to integrate the different relevant theories into these different variables.
Okay.
Integrates means that whoever the reference you put, you look at this reference and try to see what the theoretical base they look at. So what the theories these authors use. So you can write one sentence before their findings, and then you can discuss your findings. So this is like scenario number one. Scenario number two, leave everything as it is or as they are, and then add two sections. One to identify the research gaps, and then you can explain how different theories offer some ideas to fill these gaps.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Doctor.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Lamia. Also, I want to ask all if you want to ask any question, please don't write your question in the chat because I can't follow all of your chatting. So please write your question in Q&A or can raise your hand and we'll go one by one to ask Dr. Khalid. Thank you so much. Shumuch?
Someone raised his hand or her hand for a long time.
Mbarka? Okay. Mbarka?
Yes, hello?
Hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, cool. First of all, I want to thank you because the presentation you've made, it was really interesting and so beneficial. And concerning my questions, I want you to give us some advice so that our articles are going to be accepted for publication.
Okay.
And my major of study is English didactics, the didactics of English.
Okay, thank you very much. So to get your paper published, I think you need to look at the criteria for publication. And the most important criteria is the contribution. So you need to be sure that you have an incremental contribution to what has been done in the literature. You should have a strong research motivation, explaining why you are doing this particular research area. Also, you should have a sound research method. So your research method should be justified. So also you should choose the right journal which has the aim and scope which match your research paper. And I think finally your paper should tell the reader a story, something new, and this story should have an impact on practice. And finally, the paper should be well written. So if you satisfy these criteria, I think you will have a chance to get your paper published.
Thank you. Concerning my second question, like what if I test like a new method in teaching and then the results are not really what I expected? For example, I say like the impact of like online teaching on improving the achievements of learners, and then if I apply it and I find many obstacles and concerning like, you know, in Arabic countries, the internet connection is not really, not everyone is, like not everyone has access to the a good internet connection. So what if the results are not really what I wished?
Okay, so first of all, the researcher shouldn't be biased to get a specific results. So you have a research idea, you have some, let's say, assumptions, you test this assumption and doesn't work. So nothing wrong if the results are not as you expected. But I think the challenge will be your interpretation of this result. So you need to explain why this happened. What are the potential reasons that what the result you get is different from what you have expected? I think if you explain well, so the interpretation of the result will be the most important element in your paper compared with the result itself. So you shouldn't be biased or you shouldn't be focused on the result, but you need to focus more on the interpretation of the result. And I think you try to explain why this result was not as expected.
Okay, thank you so much. And
Yeah,
that was okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mbarka. شموخ.
Yes, hello.
الو
الو مرحبا، واضح الصوت؟
واضح. اهلا وسهلا بك، اتفضلي.
Yes, أهلا وسهلا. My question, first of all, thank you very much for the informative session. It was very informative and very beneficial for all PhDs, I believe. My question is regarding the period of the study. What would be sufficient in terms of the years applied, 5 years or 10 years, when we're testing certain hypotheses? And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Shmukh. For the period of the study, it doesn't matter, but the most important thing, the period of study should be justified. So you should justify why you started by a particular year and also why you ended by a particular year. So it doesn't matter 2 years or 3 years or 5 or 10 or 100 years. I think justification matters rather than the number of years.
Yes, that's very clear. Thank you very much, Doctor.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shmukh. Iman?
Yes, do you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you, Iman.
Okay, first of all, thank you for this very interesting session. Actually, I have a question. If you could please give me some tips to perfectly link the chapters without having the problem of the omission variables, because sometimes I feel like the second chapter could be just added into the first one by adding this main explaining variable in the first module. So if you see my question, I don't know if I have been clear or not.
It is not clear to me. Can you clarify the question?
Yes, sometimes when I link the chapters, I don't, well, excuse me, but how to perfectly link the chapters and the article-based thesis without having the problem of omitted variables.
Okay, So if you are paper-based and if you need to convince the reader that you don't have problems of omitted variables, I think you need to provide a test to confirm that there is no problem of omitted variables in your model in each of these chapters. Because I understand your point, so might be the examiner might say that rather than having 4 chapters, each chapters consider 1 variables, why not consider merge all of them in 1 chapter? Because rather than discussing diversity for age diversity in 1 chapter, gender diversity in another chapter, and education diversity in another chapter, why not including all these types of diversity in 1 model?
Yes, exactly
Yes.
that. Yes.
I think to avoid these kind of problems, you need to test for the omitted variables. So you need to convince the reader that you don't have omitted variables problem. At the same time, you should be clear at the start of your PhD, explaining what are the main objectives you are trying to achieve. Why you believe that, let's say, gender diversity is a story in its own, rather than gender and education and age and nationality should be all being together. So you might have some analysis to find the correlation between these 4 diversity measures. So you can say they are highly correlated. We can put all of them in 1 regression model. So that's why we separate in separate chapters and at the same time provide a test for the omitted variables.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amini. And also thank you, Dr. Khalid. قلت الثيسز مالتي كلها. By the way, Doctor, I have also a question. So most universities, when they graduate, mostly in UK, they publish our thesis in what's called Thomas or Tosum. I think there's a website that all theses they put it in this site, which is the British Library in UK. So the question is, when they publish our thesis, so how we can publish it as a paper in the journal? So just we can write down like this is a part of our PhD and that's okay, or it will be published, when they check it in any program to check the similarities.
Okay, first of all, PhD and the master thesis are not published material. So we always mention to any PhD as unpublished PhD. So this is the first point. So if they publish the whole thesis in their website, they just have a store collecting all these PhD theses, but still unpublished. So in your publication, you can write in the acknowledgement, this paper is chapter 5 of my PhD thesis, and I would like to thank the examiners or the supervisors. So you can acknowledge that this paper is part of your PhD. And in case if the journal try to make the similarity index using Turnitin, and they found, let's say, 75% of this paper is from this thesis, they will look at the author name. And if this is the same author name, they will understand this paper from your PhD. So there is no problem at all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khalid, for clarification. Hamoud? Hamoud, if you don't mind, unmute your mic. Yes, right now we can hear you. Go on. حمود ما نسمعك. We can't hear you. Maybe you have a problem in your mic. Or Hamoud, you can write your question in Q&A.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Firstly, I want to thank you for this valuable session. My inquiry that I'm confused about the importance of the study and contribution. Are they the same or there is a difference? Thank you.
Okay, this is very good questions, Hamoud. Thank you very much. Importance mean why this study is important. Importance, let's say the contribution first. Contribution means that what is new? What is your addition to the literature? What did you add to the literature? What did you add to knowledge? What did you add to the theory, the methodology, to the practice? But the importance mean why this study is important and might be important to whom as well. So contribution means what you have done and what's your addition to the literature. And I think the importance try to explain why you focus on this area.
Okay, but how to write it in my thesis? Both or what?
Yes, you need to write both of them because in your research background, you will mention to the research problem. So after mentioning to the research problem, you will say that this research problem is important for investigation because of these reasons. And after that, you can say that in my thesis, I provide a contribution to knowledge by adding this and this and this.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Dr. Khalid, if you don't mind, let's go to YouTube. There is some question, and then we'll go back to Zoom. So there is a question from Dr. Laskar. Very useful presentation, Professor Khalid, and he has a question. Can you please ask him to elaborate on research questions, objectives, and hypotheses? So this is his question.
Okay, first of all, the research objectives is the main objectives the author of the thesis or the student try to achieve. For example, if we are talking about board diversity and performance, the objective will be to find out if diversity has an impact on performance. What does it mean? If more women on the board of directors improve the performance of the company or decrease the performance of the company. So this like what the researcher try to do, what the researcher plan to do in his or her PhD. For example, if you look at disclosure, one of the objectives might be to provide a new measure for disclosure. Another objective might be to look at factors affecting disclosure, why firm disclose information. The third objective might be what are the impact of disclosure on the investors or financial analysts. So the objectives here is the mechanisms that the researcher try to do in order to achieve the main aim of his work. The research questions, again, is linked with the research question. So if with the research objective. So if the research objective is to find the impact of diversity on performance, the research question will be, does diversity affect performance? Does female directors affect performance? Does nationality affect performance? So these kind of questions reflect on the research objectives. The research hypothesis is the way we are trying to test the relationship between the variables. We expect, based on some theories, that the relationship between diversity and performance is positive or negative or no relationship. So we build or we develop this research hypothesis based on the theories, and then in the empirical side of the thesis, we try to test this hypothesis so we can accept or reject the research hypothesis. I think these are three concepts I mentioned in the introduction.
Thank you, Professor. Also, there is another question in YouTube. They ask about the relationship or the coherence between PhD proposal and the PhD thesis.
Okay. You mean the coherence between them? I think for the PhD and proposal and the PhD thesis will be more advanced, more developed compared with the proposal. The students spend just few months to write the proposal, but for the PhD, it requires work for 3 or 4 years full time. For the research proposal and PhD thesis, both should be coherent, so the sections should be linked together. I discussed today for the PhD. So for the proposal, you need to start by research objectives or aim and objectives, research questions. What are the potential contributions? You need also to survey the key literature and to mention to the methodology, which will help you to answer your research questions.
Thank you, Professor. And also there is one very good question, and I think many students ask the same question, which is from Mishal. He asked, hello, if my research is new and I can't find related subjects in the region, what would be my gap and limitation, and what can I do?
Okay, so if you believe that your research is new, this might mean that no one else touched this area. So you need to look at the origin of this research area. It shouldn't be like brand new. I think you can. So if, for example, if we're talking about research about COVID-19, so we might think that it's something new, but if we try to find out similar scenarios happened over the last few years, we can find different scenarios and we can identify what is relevant to our study, what studies have been covered before, and we can focus on. So for the new research area, I think it's easily you can get the literature. At least you need to explain why other researchers does not cover this research area, what this research area is related to, in which field, and to what extent your contribute to the field itself. I think the new research idea should be linked somehow to any dimension of the fields you are interested in.
Thank you, Professor. Back to Q&A questions. There's a question, if you can open the Q&A with me, Professor Khalid. Below there is the Q&A button. So Mohammed Al-Mhamid asked, thanks Dr. Al-Qattan and Professor Khalid, very informative. My question is, are these links are necessary in the research proposal, as we have limited time to defend and write? Thanks.
Okay, Muhammad, I think yes, in the research proposal, the sections included in the proposal should be linked together. So your research proposal should be coherent. So the research objectives should be linked with the research questions, and both should be linked with the potential contributions. Your literature should be related to the research aim and objectives. Your research method also should be related to the research objective. So in this way, you have a coherent proposal, and this will increase your chance to get an offer from the university you are applying to.
Thank you, Professor. Also, a question from Karima asks, what about a PhD in the literature when we are dealing with novels?
I don't know what you mean here, Karima, I'm sorry.
I think, Professor, the same question about the YouTube one, which is about the novel or the contribution, if it's the only, or it's a new research in the literature and they didn't find any previous research that talk about the same subject. So
you can search for other research which indirectly talk about the same subject. So if I'm talking about, again, COVID-19 related disclosure, no one before mentioned or measured COVID-19 disclosure, but we have different measures for disclosure in general. So I can borrow some measures from the disclosure literature and focus specifically on COVID-19 related information.
Yeah, or maybe the previous virus, maybe that happened.
Yes, or previous virus. If someone in accounting talk about the previous virus, I can see what happened and follow him or follow his approach, or at least I can differentiate my work from his work.
Kuider ask, what is the difference between thesis and dissertation? And is it possible to divide the chapter into two parts?
Okay, for in the UK, we consider the dissertation is a simple one for a master students, which include just one empirical chapter. For the PhD is more comprehensive because it's for PhD, and we expect at least 2 empirical chapters in the PhD thesis. And of course, you can divide the chapter into 2 parts. It's better to have like this kind of division in the chapter to make the chapter easy to read and follow. Dr. Ahmed, are you online?
Sorry, I am reading, but I forget to mute. Sorry. Could I please give some tips on how to perfectly link the chapters without having the concern on...
I think, Dr. Ahmed, I answered this question.
Oh, all right.
And for as well.
Okay, there is another one. مشكور أستاذ حسين خالد حسيني وأستاذ أحمد. عندي سؤال، هل الدراسات السابقة نخصص لها فصل كامل؟ وكم عدد الفصول المطلوبة والأفضل للدراسة، 5 أم 6 فصول؟ شكرا.
لو سمعت المحاضرة أو تسمعها مرة أخرى إن شاء الله، نعم الدراسات السابقة ممكن نخصص لها فصل كامل. عدد فصول المطلوبة للرسالة مختلف عليها، الحد الأدنى 5 فصول، وهقول الحد الأقصى 10 فصول.
Eamon ask again, could I have some tips on how to perfectly link the chapter? I think the same thing.
Answer one.
Yeah. Shumuch, regarding the period of the study, how many?
One.
Oh,
yes.
Lamia, did we answer this question?
No, we answered. I think we answered the question to them.
Oh, right.
No.
Yes or no?
Possible to send to us at email, and how can I know about future session? For you.
Yes. So I will put in the chat all my accounts, and everyone can connect to those to see the future webinars in ITAR. Najud, and thank you for the question. Najud asked, how can I write thesis results correctly?
It's very, very big question. I think you need to keep an eye on your research objectives. Then look at the analysis, look at your tables, and try to answer the research questions you have raised in the introduction. And if you have research hypothesis in chapter 3 or 4, try to explain to what extent each of these research hypotheses is accepted or rejected, and then link these findings with the literature and also to different theories.
Huda asked, my question is about methodology chapter. I used mixed method in 3 scenarios that each one is depending on the other. The problem I have faced that the 3 scenarios have a totally different methods that can make the reader confused and make the chapter very heavy. However, I was thinking to include these sections on their chapters, in their chapter, but the other concern is how can I present the mixed methods in each chapter or refer the reader to section in a specific chapter that might be make harder to read.
Okay, thank you, Hoda, for this interesting question. If you are using mixed approach or mixed method, I think you can, yes, you can have one methodology chapter, and in this methodology chapter, you can divide it into 3 sections. One section discuss the qualitative part, second section discuss the quantitative part, and the third section discuss the mixed approach between qualitative and the quantitative. And yes, in each following chapter, you can easily refer to the methodology chapter and explain to which section you are referring the reader to. I think this is something traditional and acceptable, and using mixed approach is a huge contribution in the field. So I think if you read any PhD thesis, you will find just they mentioned to the 3 methods in one chapter. So there is no problem with that.
Sorry, I forget it's muted. Imad asked, do you advise to have one thesis which will written as a guide to follow in PhD journey?
Yes, in accounting, I can recommend some. If you email me, I can send you a couple of theses related to accounting or finance is my field. Yes.
Coder ask, is possible to write hypothesis directly after research question in chapter 1?
Yes, in chapter 1, you can write the research hypothesis after the research questions. It is acceptable. Some examiners don't like it. In Portsmouth, we are welcome a student to write research hypothesis in chapter 1. Personally, I don't like it. I think that we shouldn't write it in the methodology, in the introduction chapter. But again, it's up to the examiner and the supervisor.
Thank you so much, Professor. Anyone have any question? Please, if you have any question, just raise your hand or ask question in Q&A. I think Imad asked, yes, Professor, my field in accounting, and I contact with you yesterday on Facebook. So please, also the same thing. For me, I don't know the numbers who ask me in Facebook. So I don't know, Professor Khalid, how many thousands of people who ask him. So I think the best way to send him in directly email. Sorry. So again, me as well. If when I contact Professor Khalid, I know him in person, but I know if I send him an email, he will find the time for me. But in the Facebook and other social network, I don't think it will easily to contact other.
I'm always happy to help, so they are welcome to contact me anytime.
Thank you, Professor. Imad, just send Professor Khalid again an email. I think he will answer.
I can see other questions. Dr. Ahmed asked a good question. He asked, is it better to use I aim in this research or we aim in this research or this research aims to? My advice here, all are correct. Some examiners don't like using the word we, especially it's your PhD. You are one person writing this PhD. So try to avoid using we, especially if you are using the traditional PhD thesis. I aim is very weak, although I use it in my PowerPoint, but I think the research aims is better than I aim or we aim.
There is a question from Jinan, how to avoid repetitiveness with connecting the chapters and reminding the reader about what mentioned in previous sections.
Yes, this is very big question, very tough one, because if you remind the reader every time about the previous chapter and the following chapter, I think you will repeat the same sentence or are telling the same things It will be like very annoyed paragraphs for the reader to read. Look at the previous chapter, I discussed this and this and this. Look at the following chapter, I discussed this and this and this. So I think just one simple sentence rather than copying and paste from the previous chapters will be helpful to prepare the reader, to remind him what you have done, what you have covered, and also will help you to connect with the following chapters. So don't copy and paste, just rephrase the main story of the previous chapter in one sentence, and introducing the following chapter just in one sentence. And in this case, you will avoid any repetitive information.
Thank you so much, Professor. Do you end the question? Or you
Yeah,
have...
we still have one question from Professor Hawam. Can you see
from
it?
where? From where did you?
Above Jinan.
Jinan, Q&A. No, I can't see any questions.
I can see the question. At our university in Algeria, at our university, chapter ends with a summary. However, conclusion will be at the end of the thesis. I totally agree with this idea. If the PhD is traditional, each chapter should end by a summary, not a conclusion. But if the PhD is paper-based, the chapter should end by a conclusion because it's paper-based, so each chapter is considered as a separate paper.
Professor, I can't see any question other than Omar, but do you have any? There is any question in Q&A or no?
I can see
in Q&A.
questions. Yes.
I don't know why I can't see it.
Okay. There is a question from Sumaya. She mentions that is those papers to be published must have the result first, then separate. I think we answered this question in the chat. Okay, Dr. Ahmed, I don't have any other questions.
Okay, Omar.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaykum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you, Dr. Khalid and Dr. Ahmed, for this great presentation. Unfortunately, I can't catch up from the beginning. However, I just have a question, please, here. For the thesis in like a paper system, is it fine to link all the chapters? Or, I mean, like in each separate chapter, is it fine to mention that these results are agreed with what we already find in chapter 1 or 2, for example? Or is that better to separate all of these and aggregate it in the conclusion chapter, which is totally separated from the main 3 empirical chapters normally? And thank you.
Thank you. So I think in terms of the result for each paper, I think in the conclusion you can link them together. But in each single chapter, you need to be careful because if the result in each separate chapter is quite similar with the previous result in the previous chapter, this might cause a problem. But at least some of the results might be quite similar, but you need to highlight that the chapter itself provide an incremental contribution compared with the contribution mentioned in the previous chapter.
Sorry, but yes, I do agree with you, Doctor, but I mean that when you find like results in the second chapter that can be supported by the results that you have in chapter 1, is that fine to mention that these results are agreed with what we already found?
Yes. If the result in chapter 2 support the finding in chapter 1, this will be acceptable, and we need that. So now the chapters are integrated to each other. So they complement each other in this case.
Okay, thank you very much. That's what I'm looking for exactly.
It's a very good point, yes.
Okay, thank you. Jazakumullah khair.
جزانا وإياك. Dr. Ahmed.
Sorry, I am talking, but also I forget. Sorry. Okay. Professor Khalid, thank you so much. Professor Khalid, you have been many times an external examiner in many universities around the world, and also internal in Portsmouth University, Stirling, and Plymouth as well. So based on your experience regarding reading all these theses and reviewing them, so what is the usual mistakes that the student make?
I think the main common mistake is the link between chapters if we are talking about writing. So mostly we find the link between chapters is not clear. Some students have a contribution, but they didn't clearly write the contribution in their thesis, chapter 1. Students understand that they are doing research on Egypt because they are Egyptian and it's not enough. We expect to see a strong motivation why students focus on a specific country. Sometimes the student just follows the advice of their supervisors by doing qualitative or quantitative or mixed method, but they don't really know the main advantages and disadvantages of using these kind of methods. So I think this is the most common mistake so following the supervisor advice is not enough. You need to find a scientific reasons for each single decision you have made in writing your PhD.
Thank you, Professor Khalid. There is a question from Ilham Mohammed بالحريث ask لو كانت رسالتي بها جزئين مختلفين في التحضيرات والتطبيقات، هل من الممكن جعل رسالتي على جزئين part 1 and part 2 أو تكون مثل الترتيب المعروف التي عرضته؟
أكيد طبعا الإجابة هتبقى على حسب التخصص. معظم رسائل الدكتوراه بتكون على جزء واحد فقط وليس part 1 and part 2. الحالات اللي أنا شفت فيها رسالات دكتوراه part 1 و part 2 لو كان حجم الرسالة زائد عن 80,000 كلمة، في هذه الحالة ممكن يكون الباحث ليه part 1 و part 2 ولكن محتاج موافقة الجامعة على هذا الموضوع.
Great. Any questions before we ending the session? Any questions? If you have any question, you can write in Q&A or raise your hand, or the people who on YouTube just write your question in comments and I will read it to Professor Khalid. All right. Professor, before we end, please, can you give us, for master and PhD student, the general advice?
Okay, my general advice is the golden advice I have received from my supervisor. Try to read articles from top-ranked journals, because by reading articles from top-ranked journals, you will learn a lot about the academic writing and the way you can connect between different sections in the article. You will also learn how to write a good literature review, how to choose the methodology, how to present your methodology, how to present your findings, how to clearly explain your motivation and contribution. So reading will help a lot to achieve the aims you are looking for.
Thank you so much, Professor Khalid, for accepting my invitation, for the helpful that you give us, the informative and beneficial webinar that you give it to us. I know you are still in the universities exactly until now, and you should be at home. But thank you so much, Professor. Many thanks. They send it in the chat. I can't read one by one. So really thank you so much, Professor, and hope to see you again in another webinar. Thank you for your effort. Thank you for your time. If you have any last word, Professor Khalid.
I would like to say thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for inviting me, and thank you for all participants for making this seminar very useful, because by asking these questions, I think the answer itself will help other researchers to get more knowledge above what I presented today. Many thanks to all of you.
Thank you, Professor Khalid. And also, I want to tell everyone, anyone have any question, you can directly contact Professor Khalid. Dr. Khalid, actually, there is a questions. Most of the audience ask about the slides. Can you send it to me and I can share it with them?
I will send it to Dr. Ahmed and he can share with all of you.
All right. So I will send it all of you when I receive the slide. Thank you again, Professor Khalid, and inshallah we'll see you in next time in the webinar. It won't be the last time. Inshallah, we'll keep it up. Thank you so much. And also, I want to thank all the audience from different universities around the world that coming today and watching this webinar. And also, thank you for who's watching in YouTube. And I can see many audience that coming before 2 hours waiting this webinar without anything in Zoom. It was just empty and starting, coming up before 2 hours from starting the webinar. So thank you so much for all of that. Our next speaker will be in 18th of December on Friday, will be Dr. Salah Al-Hammadi from Arab Open University, and he will present a research paper. Inshallah, tomorrow I will announce the registration, or maybe tonight. Who's asking regarding how can we see the future webinars? I just put all the my accounts, ITAR accounts in different softwares, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and others. Also, my channel in YouTube, so you can always watch what's past. Also, there is some ask if they attend lately, so how we can see the Professor Khalid webinar in the beginning. You can always go back to the YouTube and see the webinar from the beginning. Thank you so much, Professor Khalid. Thank you so much, all of you, and see you again.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. Assalamu alaikum.